Guys, thank you so much for joining us on this special web broadcast. I've been talking about this for the past couple of hours on my Facebook page, and this is a face that you've probably seen if you live in Central Florida on the local news, on national channels as well. Dave Benson is joining us. He's a security expert, and he is just the kind of guy we call when these horrific stories like this happen, because he has some real solid knowledge on how to inform parents and students of what to do to protect themselves in the event of something just utterly tragic like what happened in Florida this week. So Dave, I'm gonna let you just tell us a little bit about your background. I know you have an agency that's sort of dedicated to educating people on how to keep themselves safe, but tell us where you come from.
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on with my dear friend, Sonny. We go back an awful long way. I've got, by way of experience, I was with the Walt Disney Company in the security division here in Orlando, followed by about 24 years with the U.S. government, the U.S. State Department, Diplomatic Security Service. During that time, 4 overseas tours, was part of the master planning for the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta, and I retired as a director of training for the entire organization. Since I've retired, I have my own consulting firm, DJ Benson and Associates. Also do a lot of work with the Center for Personal Protection and Safety. And over time, my expertise has been honed down into workplace violence prevention and also threat assessment and threat management. And part of that is helping clients, both organizationally and individually, deal with the kind of things no one else wants to deal with, like stalkers, active shooters, people behaving badly, people that might be on what we call a path to violence.
And I want to throw this out there, guys. Anyone who's watching us right now, feel free to leave a comment. They are showing, and if you have a question directly for Dave, I can relay that to him. And I'm logged on to 2 computers right now, so hopefully I can monitor this as we go. So those are incredible qualifications, Dave. I actually didn't know that you had that extensive of training and knowledge, and I would love to say that there wasn't a need, or there weren't a need for all of the skills that you have, but in this day and age, I'm sure you're busier than ever. I want to cut right to it, because we have a lot of parents and parents of students who are tuning into this and have to have the conversation that they never wanted to have, which is how to stay alive at school. This should not be something that we discuss, especially with our young children. What can we tell them, or how do we start the conversation, even bring it up? Because we do have to educate them somehow.
Yeah, we do, and it's long gone are the days where we can hide our heads in the sand to pretend that it's. Every time we have one of these tragedies, there's always more than one parent or a surviving student that say the following: I can't believe that happened here. So first and foremost, we have to find a way, obviously age appropriate, to tell our children and our family that while it's still, regardless of what we see on TV, it's still relatively an isolated event, it can happen. And it's possible that sometimes bad things happen to good people. Just as we talk about strangers to our younger children and how to behave with that, it's the same thing. We want to be prepared in case of a serious event takes place, and then we kind of take it from there. And it's really about empowering whole family to have a more personal stake in their.
Okay, let's start by age groups here. Let's say you have a preschooler to an elementary. Actually, say preschooler to maybe a kindergartner. The young ones that are still sometimes intermingling in the bigger campuses with the older kids. I mean, is a 5-year-old, for example, too young to sit down and give this information to?
I think it's not too young. Certainly the caregivers are first and foremost who we want to provide that guidance to. And my first comment to your audience is, be an active parent. Be a pushy parent. And what I mean by that is, whether it's a daycare, personal or private, or an elementary or secondary school, ask specific questions on what security plans they have in place. So, God forbid, potential kidnapping scenarios, custody disputes, all those things. What are the rules of the road from a family perspective on who can pick up from their perspective, what their protocols are? And so when you sit down with the young ones, you want them to understand, to trust their instincts, and that you have raised them and you're continuing to raise them to look for good in people, but by the same token, if someone is asking you to do something that doesn't seem to be appropriate, right, or they're frightening people, that they need to do their best to get away from that situation right away, or ask for help from a grown-up, and then you really take it from there.
Okay, so I do want to hit on a point that we have a viewer here, David Peckham, who has a great question. Dave, stick around for 1 second because I have one more question to follow up, and then I'm going to get to yours. But you mentioned instinct and following a child's lead when he or she gives off a signal that something is a little strange. It is shocking how well equipped even our young children are to notice, for lack of a better term, weirdness. If there is something or someone or some situation, even in public, that my own children notice, maybe an altercation of some sort, they immediately tense up. They have that instinct, so we need to encourage them to trust that. But it is difficult sometimes, and I'm the parent of young children, to differentiate between, okay, yes, remove yourself from potential danger, but you also don't have to run away from every stranger. It's a difficult line to walk.
Right. Well, I'll give you a real life example, and it's chilling. I'm going to warn you in advance, but it's the truth. In the tragedy at Sandy Hook, I was giving a presentation to one of my clients, a large group, and I had a middle-aged woman, was kind of hanging on my every word, very interested, talking about safety and prevention. And when I got to talk about if you find yourself in the middle of an active shooter situation, she burst into tears and ran out of the classroom. And I thought, oh no, what did I say? What didn't I say? Well, to make a long story short, her granddaughter was the only child in one of the classrooms that got away because she trusted her instincts. And when they told her, and the shooter told the teacher to get everybody in the corner, she wouldn't do it, and she ran out of the room. So there is an example there of and it's listen, you want them to your caregivers. You want them to listen to the caregivers. A second challenge with this that we'll talk about in a bit is the caregivers, particularly in the educational system, Sonny, are told you wait and do as you're told and help will come to you. And unfortunately, in some of these dynamic, violent situations, waiting for the cavalry to come is not good, because some of these events are over in a matter of minutes. So it's a combination of doing as you're told until it doesn't seem right to you in the scenario, and you to keep or to report something suspicious or whatever it might be. As children get into the later elementary, you can have a more candid conversation, because sadly, all they have to do is turn on the television and they see what's happening.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's no child too young for questions, I'll tell you that. They hear everything, as you know, they see everything, and nothing goes unnoticed. Okay, so we're gonna get to David's question right now. He has a really good one. He says, what do you think about the idea of hiring combat veterans as guards for schools? Even after vetting them, there are still some things that can go wrong, he says. So what are your thoughts on the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, so clearly, if you have people with background and expertise, such as our combat veterans do, that is a plus. But here is the key here. No matter what you decide to do, whether it's off-duty police officers, school resource officers, security guards, or even, monitors, some of that, understand what the rules of the game are. Because having the ability to effectively fight it out with an armed person is not always the best option. And so let me go over those, and we'll probably repeat them several times. Even if you're a trained person and a combat veteran, I have all this experience with, assault weapons and as a federal law enforcement officer, but I will tell you, if you can get away, that's the best way to stay safe. Not huddle in the corner, lock yourself in a room, those options if you can't get out. But if you can get away from the threat, that's what you need to do. And if that means opening up back doors and letting kids and students out, now I know this flies in the face of some of the established principles within many of the school boards, but I want to make it very clear that that concept is changing. You need to see and hear option. And the options are, if you need to run to get out of that situation, then that's what you do. If you need to hide or barricade, go ahead.
Let me hop in real quick. If running is an option, do it. People fear running because they think that they will make themselves more visible to the shooter, that they will scream essentially, "Here, I'm a target." So how do we decide when it's worth running and when you do, in fact, you sort of hunker down?
Sure, it's a great question. So when I say believe what you see and hear, If you hear you heard this week, some of the students said, well, it sounds like firecrackers. Trust me, don't spend any moment of your life trying to determine if it's real or if it's firecrackers. If you're not used to that sound, you need to go away from the threat if you can determine that. If you're not sure going to be the threat, then you have to take some other action. So that's a great trust. It's a constant reassessment. And it's amazing how even relatively young children can make that determination, but it's got to be done by practice. So what happened in this particular case is we are all trained, even at my age as an old man, to have a robotic response to fire drills. And that means everybody files out, nobody asks any questions, and then you go into an assembly area with hundreds of people sometimes, which is the worst thing you can do in a potential act of violence like this. You want to go away from the threat, and you want to be agile enough to make some decisions. For example, a couple of the heroic teachers, they were confused by the fire drill going off, which we now believe the shooter did to confuse things. They went out, and then the code red was called, which meant for them there's a shooter in the building. She brought her students back into the classroom, locked the doors, turned out the lights, and then she went into the closet. She had 22 kids and her inside a small closet. You can do what you have to do. Another thing to keep in mind, as we've learned from Virginia Tech and other places, if there's an open window, bail out of the window as long as you don't think you're going into harm's way. So believe what you see and hear and pick an option. So run if you can, hide if you must, and then something we don't want to really teach our younger children, but certainly the faculty and admin need to understand, if it's just you and your class and the threat, you might have to make some very tough decisions to incapacitate or divert that shooter's attention or the threat's attention. So really and truly, I don't care if you have the most fortified school in the world. If your threat is inside, you might have to hide. But if the threat is outside, go in the opposite direction.
Well, doubling back on Dave's question then, do you think it's a good idea to have these highly trained people on our campuses with the sole purpose of protecting our children with firearms, even if necessary?
Okay, step at a time. We always want highly trained people in these positions if we can. But I will tell you, in some cases, volunteer parents as monitors have made tremendous differences. It's the training, Sonny, that's important, and the mindset. So a decision to whether or not we've heard conversations about arming teachers. I'm not a huge fan of that unless they have quite a bit of expertise and training, and also understanding what potential scenarios that will be helpful to them. Even if you're armed, even armed police officers know that there are scenarios where evading the threat is much better than engaging with fire. So a lot of it is what we call in my business understanding what the rules of engagement are. So whatever you decide to do or whatever your school decides to do, you want to make sure everybody's trained and everybody understands their respective role, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Give us a list of questions that we as parents should be asking our children's teachers at the beginning of every school year in reference to their emergency plans. Some very specific.
Sure. Yeah, first of all, do you have a contingency plan for kidnap, a bomb, fire, and in this case, what we call an act of extreme violence or active shooter, although it doesn't always have to be a shooter. What tends to happen sometimes is that teachers are only told certain levels of the training and expertise. I advocate having it out in the open, let the sun shine in, and if they don't know the answer to your question, either push them to find it out for you or go to administration. It's the same thing at daycares. You want to ask, what's your procedure for dropping off and picking up my child? What has to happen before someone can pick up my child? What happens if we have a crisis? So as I said, be a pushy parent and ask those questions in a polite but firm way. And if you don't get answers, take it up the food chain, because the chances might be they haven't thought about that or it's not been fully spelled out. And so even in houses of worship nowadays, it's almost becoming a source of recruitment of how secure your house of worship is. Is the nursery secure? So all those questions I think you want to ask, you know, what things like that, drugs, do you have a drug policy? What's your weapons policy? The more informed you are as parents, the better you're going to feel. And then frankly, everybody is better informed on kind of what's out there, and you can pass that on also to the kids.
do you envision a future where every teacher or daycare provider essentially also has to be, for lack of a better term, a trained safety officer of some sort? Because back when we were young, not to use that phrase, but I mean, teachers were there to teach because it did not enter into our consciousness that something so horrible could happen. So do you think eventually schools will begin requiring teachers to go through some sort of training every year?
Yes, and some school districts already do. I'm not going to specifically name school districts in this area because that's not fair, because not everybody's from the same one. But one of our big challenges here on a national level, there's no national standard for school security. There's not even an established state standard for school security. So you can go to middle school A or elementary school B, and you might have different protocols in place and different staffing. So first and foremost, we want to try to unify that. And what does that mean? That means we got to go to the polls. We have to vote. We have to question our school board members, city council candidates, county officials, to make sure they know that it's a priority for you. Yeah, I think baseline training nowadays must include basic, if not intermediate, first aid, scenario training, a bomb threat, and then frankly an act of extreme violence. And I think it should be required and part of their certification process to do that.
Dave, I'm going to ask you this, and you are free to answer it as candidly as you desire, because it will touch on issues that people have very strong feelings about. After things like this happen, there ends up being a string of debates, especially on social media, where people ask the question, what can we do? A certain camp of people will always say more gun control is the answer, or at least part of the answer. And a certain camp of people will say, it's not the gun, it's the person. Again, as comfortable as you are with sharing your views, I want you to answer the question, can we do something? Because I'm really sick of the arguments and the thoughts and the prayers only being the only response to this. Is there an actionable change that we can actually make, or are we doomed to repeat this cycle over and over?
Well, wonderful question, and the answer may surprise you. Standardization of schools, security is one thing. First of all, let's talk about the and Sonny, you know this from working with me, a tiered approach. Outside the school, there's got to be some type of surveillance, and not just cameras, because someone's got to be watching those cameras. But you need to have, in some cases, human beings on that campus patrolling. It can even be teachers on duty or admin people on duty, keeping what's going on outside the immediate area, in addition to keeping in touch with law enforcement and what's going on in the community. Second of all, there needs to be standardized access control procedures for schools. I promise you, I can go to 5 schools in the Central Florida area, and the access controls will be different. And so that is part of it. Whatever we decide to do, realizing the touchiness of this, Sonny, is we're talking about resources. And resources mean money, and money means politics. So we're going to try to keep the politics out of it. I'll take on the gun issue here in a minute. But the reality of it is there's some things we can do right now. First of all, keeping an eye on each other, surveillance outside, the standardized procedures within the school for visitors, family members, former students. What happens if there's a disciplinary action and that student is expelled, like was the case here? Is there a protocol to make sure they don't come back? And if so, who knows about it, and how is that communicated to include? So, and then the final piece, which I think will surprise you, is we need to have what I call behavioral intervention teams, threat management teams. It's what I've dedicated my life work to. What are they? Multidisciplinary group made up of faculty, administration, local law enforcement, threat assessment professionals like myself, where they get together periodically and maybe they monitor troubled youth, okay? And maybe they develop intervention strategies where someone needs to go knock on the door and see how the young person is, talk to the parents, see if the parents are part of the solution or part of the problem, and how are they progressing, not just the normal discipline of suspension and counseling that goes with that. And when you do that, we might have a better chance well in advance of these horrible events to see somebody going on what we call the path of violence. Very briefly.
Well, I want to interrupt really quickly. I want to offer some perspective here, because you brought up something that I think a lot of people have been in the position of before. You see someone either at a workplace or at school that is just strange. And our human instinct kicks in. The running joke is if something were to happen, that would be the person. Everybody has said that about someone. I don't care who you are, someone at work or school, because the sad story is
right.
It's easy to see who has the potential sometimes for this type of violence. As in this case, violence toward animals, violence toward partners before, a pattern of mental instability, whatever it is. So, but you go to a person in control and say, hey, listen, I think so-and-so has got some issues, and I'm scared that he or she's going to, come back after being expelled, for example, and causing problems. And people look at you like you're crazy. And I think that sort of needs to change too, because I've been in the position, or have had friends in the position where they've thrown the red flag up in a school or in a workplace, and people look at them like they're the problem. So it seems like we have to normalize the process of reporting some of these concerns too, because no one wants to be the guy that's just tackling on people.
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head, and that was going to be my next point. And the concept is, this is not a school issue. This is not just a parent issue. This is not a county issue. This is a community issue. I didn't say fault. I said it's a community issue, and that means everybody needs to do their part. So parents and civilians and students need to be empowered to know what to look for, not to be an expert, but to understand if it's a change in someone's behavior and it's not them, something's going on there that they can report it. Conversely, the second piece of that, which is the administration, those in authority, to include law enforcement, have to take the time to process that information and share it if they need to and see if there's anything to it. And then finally, there has to be what we call an intervention strategy. And that is, hey, we're going to decide that Johnny is not coming back to school until we sort out this behavioral issue and some of the other things that we heard. And it's a partnership that goes with that. And by the way, it's not about can we arrest them or can we not arrest them. Some of these people are deeply troubled or have other things going on in their life that their coping mechanisms are nearly non-existent. So to react and to protect themselves, believe it or not, they jump on this path of violence. So, and by the way, there's two classic examples of what I'm talking about, this layered approach of threat management and threat intervention. It's already happening in colleges around the country. I help teach. Those have been hit very hard. We don't see it as much on the primary and secondary level, and it needs to happen. Community intervention teams. The LA County Department of Mental Health and the LA School District pioneered this program. It's an amazing program. And there were some tough kids that they dealt with too and still do, but they have a process. Do we need to go out and talk to them? Do we counsel them? We keep an eye on them, not in a spying way, but in a kind of a caring way to make sure that they are not left and neglected and we are missing until one of the days we wake up and we have a tragedy. And everybody, with all due respect to your former profession, I'll often hear in the media, somebody snapped. Let me be very clear to your audience. Violence is almost always not spontaneous. It's almost always a build-up over time. Certainly targeted violence of people that perpetrate these acts. What does that tell us? With a little help and working as a community, we can sense these things. So when you said you see something, say something, the problem with that is, and then see something, know who to report that to, and then follow up if you don't hear anything back. And we, to this day, the second community that does this is Salem, Oregon. They do a great job. They have schools, they have businesses, they have the police, they have nonprofits. The media is even part of that team, so they understand, because no group of our society is immune from these acts of extreme violence. That's what we need to do here.
Right. So is gun control the answer?
Responsible, first of all, realistic, as a federal agent, I carried weapons my whole career. I own guns myself, but I advocate responsible gun ownership, number one. Number two, let's enforce this, and there's already loopholes all the way through it. Let's make sure the background checks mean something. Let's make sure the cooling off period makes something. Then number three, let's partner together, God forbid, in a bipartisan effort to realize regardless of how people feel about the Second Amendment, that it's not going to completely go away. So we have to regulate some of these extreme weapons, in my view, that have no business in the hands of children and people that have some other mental issues or whatever.
Right, Dave, and I hope I'm not the only person who is just absolutely sickened by the snail's pace or worse that our government responds to things in. And it seems like in times like this, when leaders should be leading with action, all we get are sound bites. And now I worked in the media. I can appreciate a good soundbite. Thanks. It's going to help get viewers to our TV and newscast. Great. But you know what? I'm kind of sick of hearing you talk about it now. And I feel like so many people agree with this sentiment, yet our leaders, whether they be at the state or the federal level, or even in some cases the local level where they have the power to do this, they don't do anything. It drives me nutso, as I'm sure it does so many other people. What can we do besides just completely, flood their email inboxes and leave voicemails? How can we as citizens let these leaders know that we are ready to be heard on this issue?
Right. It's a great point. And probably the most important thing that all citizens can do is to make sure you vote and vote your conscience. Okay. I don't want to get into party lines. This is a bipartisan issue. This should not have any political implication. This is the safety and security of our children. And I can carry it into the other acts of extreme violence that we're having all over the country. But let's just keep it within the concept of this. I don't want to hear anymore to not do that. We need to honor the victims. Because guess what? For the first time in a long time, those young people and moms and dads are screaming back at their political figures, and they're not putting up with this rhetoric anymore. And when it's time to vote, what do they stand for? And where were you when there was a vote on these issues? That's number one. Number two, the activist parents. Go to school board meetings, even though you're tired. Ask those questions. Pursue proper funding. Talk to your elected law enforcement officials. And while we're blessed to have some really good ones in the Central Florida area, hold them accountable too. We're all part of this process. So it's public sector, private citizens, and communities, and make this a non-political issue that the safety and security of our children is paramount, and we'll accept nothing less.
I mean, God, I hope that this is the event that changes the tide, and that someone lights fire under their you-know-whats, but we'll see. I want to bring up a point, John. It was live on the broadcast here, and we were talking about the gun issue, and he says the black market problem, the fact that a lot of these weapons are not being sold in legal ways, but bad guys are getting their hands on them in illegal ways as well. Sometimes it does feel like even with some common sense legislation, this black market issue would still make this a problem, would make controlling violence a problem. What do you say to that?
Well, I think it's true. Now, there's always going to be a certain aspect of outlaws, if you will, that are going to find a way to both bring in and use and import drugs and weapons and everything else, a larger societal issue. But in reality, the penalties for gun shows and penalties for gun shops and even gun owners for personally, privately transferring weapons that might be perfectly legal to someone that may be particularly sketchy. We all have to take some responsibility for this. And so recognizing the more that we regulate in a responsible manner, the better off we're going to be, and we're going to be able to minimize that. Now, having said that, I will tell you, you don't need a gun to commit mass murder. And so bombs will happen, and so, where access to weapons is hard, they'll use bladed instruments and machetes. But the reality of it is empowering and training people what to recognize, what doesn't seem right to you, report it, take some action, makes all the difference in the world. As we work this, we're not going to be able to change this overnight, but I'm also convinced we're not going to make a dent in this unless this is a community response.
Yeah, and it is time to talk to all the politicians, all the community leaders. We don't want to hear you say anymore, now is the time. So, and this goes for anyone, I feel like, no matter what side of the issue and these more heated issues that you fall on, I sure hope that they recognize that now is the time. We don't want to be silent anymore. We don't want to sit here and wait for something else to happen, because God forbid something like this happens to our children again. I don't know how much longer we collectively can handle the sort of trend that we've been on in this country. I want to mention to everyone here too, you guys have been great about leaving questions. If anyone else, we're going to wrap up within the next probably 5 minutes or so, but now's the time to ask if you have any information or any questions for Dave. He has tons of information, and you heard him mention at the beginning too, this doesn't just apply to his experience in the violence prevention in schools and companies. You've worked on the federal level, the Olympics, I mean, everything. I said it before, I'm going to say it again. Dave, you're a great guy, but man, I wish we could put you out of work.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And you know, the reason for that, it's a passion of mine. The other thing I want to talk about before we sign off, Sonny, is the role that I'm seeing. What emerging threats are happening in our country and where they're coming from. You know, it used to be if someone made a threat to harm or hurt somebody, they'd leave an anonymous phone call, they'd write them a letter, or spray paint some graffiti. It's almost all now coming from social media. So again, parents, know what's going on in your children's social media. Pay attention to those things. Teach them to be sensitive that if someone is saying hurtful things, because I have news for you. Bullying doesn't stop with just bullying. Sometimes bullying goes to harassment behavior, and in the small select few that have a significant challenge that they're dealing with, they can turn to violent tendencies, either to themselves, suicidal ideation, or harming others. So we really need that. It's great that we have an anti-bullying program in our schools, but you know what? Guess what happens? They grow up to be our colleagues and our friends and our neighbors. And so recognizing what doesn't seem right and not being afraid to kind of share that. So social media, good as it is, devastating for making threats. I deal with real-time threats where people will threaten to harm others, organizations, threaten to harm themselves. We need to be much more aware of what people say, the context in what they say, and how we treat each other. Inadvertently trigger a violent event by how we treat people.
And these people leave a trail. We always go back in media and cover the social media histories of some of these violent suspects, and there is always something that indicated that these people were not stable. And in this case, there was a YouTube comment about mentioning about being being a school shooter. I mean, these things are happening. And again, don't be scared to be the person that red flags this. This could be at your workplace. This could be, you know, within a group of friends. I have situations where, you know, women who are dealing with abusive exes, they exhibit signs. And I mean, don't be scared to be the whistleblower, because God knows someone has to be the one that kind of throws up the red flag once in a while. If you could, Dave, in order to wrap up, let's just, because we started focusing on the school-related issues, can you just run us through a quick bullet-pointed list of some things that we need to keep in mind as parents, questions, again, to ask our students, teachers, and things that we, in particular, maybe some good conversation starters for our kids to bring this up.
Right, and it doesn't have to be confrontational. Sit down as a family and discuss, particularly if they've been exposed to it by turning on the TV, that sometimes in our world we can't explain it, but bad things happen. And so we need to be prepared for those, not because we're fearful, but we want everybody to be mindful and prepared in case there's a challenge. And then you can start from there. And children, I've done a lot of training with children in martial arts over the years. They will have questions. And be prepared. Don't candy coat this. We don't need to give them graphic details. Pointed questions, please be honest with them and try to address them and see what their reaction is. And compare notes with your other parents and in the community. Take advantage of resources within the community. Be a pushy parent. Ask pointed questions. Make sure you are comfortable with what's happening at your school, at your daycare, in your office place. Make sure there's policies and procedures and training and expertise in place to deal with these things. And if it's not, don't be shy about making sure you do what you need to do to get people to focus on that. The final piece I will leave is we all have a stake in our own safety and security. The police can't do it by themselves. The school system can't do it by themselves. The government can't. So we need to be aware of our surroundings, think of areas we have to escape from, whether we're driving or as a middle schooler or a teenager or a younger kid walking from school or whatever it might be, or as a parent. What doesn't seem right to you? If it doesn't seem right, probably go someplace in public or wherever, let somebody know it probably isn't right. And then continue to work together as a community to realize that, with all due respect to the politicians in Washington, which is where I came from, cut my teeth protecting those folks. If we wait for them, it'll be a long time. You know how we'll get their attention? By rising up and telling them we're not going to put up with this anymore, and we want answers to some of these difficult questions.
Yeah, we're not going to put you in office anymore if you don't.
Exactly. I mean, exactly.
Yeah, it's too much it's too much to solve with just one person. So like you said, the collective effort and not being scared to be pushy, I think, is great advice for parents. Dave, I so appreciate you taking some time to do this. I'm really glad we were able to have you on, and even post TV news career here that I can bother you and cut into your free time by asking you to give advice. But
maybe we can. You're welcome. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Maybe we can have a session sometime about domestic violence and talk about that as well, because I do a lot of work there.
That's a great idea. And, you know, on this page, I just want to, for anyone who's new to this Facebook page, a lot of content here geared toward parents and mothers and women and just people who are dealing with that stage in life where you're not only worried about yourself, but you're also worried about a couple little people that you're helping raise in the world too. So Dave, we will bring you back for that. And let us know before we sign off where we can find you on social media.
Sure. On Facebook, DJ Benson and Associates, LLC. You can find it that way by searching for it. My website is securingsouls.com, securingsouls1word.com. I can also be reached by email, Dave, D-A-V-E, @securingsouls.com. And I'm even happy to give you my phone number if I can be of assistance, 407-361-2821. We're happy to have a conversation. Anything to keep the community safe and secure, I'm happy to do it.
We're so grateful for your help. That website is securingsouls.com. So guys, check it out. And Dave, we will chat with you soon. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.